15.
Well, actually, I wasn't going to mention the Samuel Johnson Prize, Rosie, so we'll keep that for later. So I was looking at publicity material about this evening on the internet a day or so ago, and I came across Pavlova Diaries out and about in Notting Hill. Are Pavlova Diaries here this evening? 5 times 15 is here again, the intellectual man's soiree. Intellectual women, raise your hands. At the Tabernacle, 5 times 15 still has tickets available for this Monday, the 21st of March. Fantastic speakers, as usual, including writer Patrick French, left in a very bad photograph, last seen by one of the Pavlova team, age 15, swigging vodka on a Channel ferry en route to a French exchange. Happy days. I'd love it if Pavlova would come up to the stage and join us. So anyway, I went on the French exchange, and Europe was interesting enough, but 2 years later, or 3 years later, I went to India for the first time, and then became increasingly intrigued by the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and ended up writing The Life of France's Younghusband, the Victorian explorer who later decided that he was going to start a new religion and be the father of the new Messiah. And I went on from there to writing about partition, Indian independence, the creation of Pakistan. But when I was in India in about 2001, 2002, I noticed that the country seemed to be changing rather rapidly, and it seemed almost as if the kind of traditional British ideas of India needed to be updated quite quickly. So if you look at the first slide, it'll be a familiar image, the idea of the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, on the left, Lady Curzon, and a very large dead tiger which Curzon has just shot. And in fact, when I got back from Delhi to London a few weeks ago, amazingly, I heard the Far Pavilions on the radio in 20 episodes. And it seemed almost as if that traditional British view of India was still intact. And of course, you can find it in E.M. Forster, you can find it in movies, and you can find it in a kind of cultural idea which persists up until today. I don't know if you remember towards the end of last year when, I've actually got a bonus 2.5 minutes because I haven't yet turned this over. But I don't know if you remember towards the end of last year when David Cameron went on his first big foreign trip with various cabinet ministers, CEOs, and it was India that he went to. And it was quite a successful trip in many ways. The idea was, to put it simply, that we in Britain have a minus 0.5 annual growth rate, annual GDP, whereas in India it's about 9%. And so the consequences of that for us in 10 or 20 years' time are immense. And I think the idea was to try to drum up British business, and it went reasonably well. But what was interesting was that he did a quite good 1-hour-long TV interview with Karan Thapa, who's a kind of Jeremy Paxman equivalent in Indian television. And as a throwaway final question, Karan Thapa said, "Oh, what about the Kohinoor diamond in the crown jewels? Do you want to give it back to India?" You remember that Queen Victoria looted the Kohinoor diamond, or it was given to her by the child ruler of Punjab in the 1860s. And so David Cameron said, "Oh no, we'll keep it in England." And the front page lead headline in the Daily Telegraph the next morning, a paper which I do occasionally write for, the front page headline was, "Hands off the jewel in our crown." And my feeling was, well, you know, that sort of line plays reasonably well in Britain, but it plays very badly in the subcontinent, and something needs to be updated. You know, Lord Curzon is not the Viceroy any longer. So that's kind of, if you like, the traditional British view of India. And then, of course, if you go on to the next slide, you'll see that wonderful picture of Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy, Jawaharlal Nehru just about to become India's first Prime Minister beside him, and then, of course, Edwina Mountbatten sharing a joke with Jawaharlal Nehru. And this, again, is part of that kind of romance of India, the romance of the subcontinent, which goes on to this day. And if you were to take a sort of reverse consequence of all that, which also is very much part of the way in which we in Britain think about India, it would probably be encapsulated in the next image, which is broadly the kind of the Bob Geldof approach to the third world, the idea that they can't help themselves and that we need to help them and give advice, and that this kind of immense suffering or poverty that you see can only be alleviated by some kind of external help. Now, the problem with that idea is that it's being contradicted by events so rapidly. The transformation in India is not simply a handful of super rich who you see listed in Forbes magazine. It's also a middle-class social and economic revolution. And in fact, I'm only going to read one thing this evening, but it sums up this view so well. And amazingly, it comes of all people from Sarah Palin. Now, Sarah Palin decided to get into foreign policy last week when she went to New Delhi. And she made a speech and then answered questions on stage. I think it was on Friday or Saturday. One of the things she said in answer to a question was that she had noticed when she was flying in that Japan is about midway between Alaska and India. She's famous, of course, for her geographical observations, noticeably that she could see Russia from Alaska and therefore would be able to deal with Russia. But anyway, she said during her speech, back home in Alaska, actually I can't do it's a particularly hard American accent. It's not the normal American accent. It's a kind of, I can't do the Tina Fey impression is what I'm trying to say to you. Back home in Alaska, where the fresh snow blankets the ground today, where my kids texted me to report they see a mama moose. That is a mama moose. And her 2 baby calves outside our door by the firewood pile. There at home, I have a beautiful pencil drawing on my kitchen wall. It's a picture of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. She's holding a precious child, a baby. It was said of Mother Teresa that perhaps the greatest message she has given to the world is the value of dignity and human life. From India, she was able to share this crucial message with the world. So if you move on from that idea, that kind of post-colonial idea, which still somehow holds sway alongside the Lord Curzon and the Tiger approach, I guess there's one other popular idea of India that we have, which is in the next picture. This is Mallika Sherawat, the Bollywood star. And in the next talk by Jackie Smith, she's going to actually remove her blouse. But to talk about her for the moment, sort of almost fully clothed. The Bollywood fixation in Britain, I don't know exactly where it originates from. It's been around for about 10 or 20 years. And it's probably a bit like looking at Britain in terms of perhaps Ealing comedy combined with Victoria and David Beckham, and say, if you link those two together, that's the epitome of Britishness. And I'm not saying Bollywood is irrelevant, but it's only part of the picture. So what does India think of Britain? Well, I can now show a very short clip from a film from 1985 called Mad, the Man. And this features the young Bollywood superstar Amitabh Bachchan, but you don't in fact see him. What you're going to see now is the opening minute. And if you can imagine the characters who you're going to see, and this is a kind of typical Indian version of Britain, or at least an Indian version of British India. The characters you're going to see are Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, who is subtitled as Mr. Carson, K-A-R-S-O-N, or Curzon Saab. And you're also going to see General Dyer, the author of the 1919 Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar, but he's actually played by an Indian actor, so it's a little bit confusing. But when they say General Dyer, then you'll understand. And then last of all, you've got somebody called Simon, and Simon is a villainous Britisher who I suspect may be Sir John Simon, who led the Simon Commission in the 1920s to try to move towards Indian self-rule. Well, that's only a guess. But Simon is the one in the white jacket who looks like a wine waiter. So off we go.
अंग्रेजों के जुल्म अभी कम नहीं हुए थे कि उन्होंने लूट मार का रास्ता भी अख्तियार कर लिया और हमारे मुल्क के कीमती खजाने को
So there they are looting India. And then you can see a wooden armored car with a rather curious Union flag on the front of it.
जल्दी करो ऊपर पीछे रखो इसको कर्जन साहब खजाना तो सब लूट लिया है
There you see he's looted all the treasure.
क्या करना
इनके बारे में तो मैंने अभी कुछ सोचा ही नहीं।
जल्दी सोच लो कर्जन साहब, अगर राजा आजाद सिंह को पता चल गया कि आप हमारे देश का खजाना लूट कर ले जा रहे हो, तो याद रखो वो तुम्हारे किसी आदमी को जिंदा नहीं छोड़ेंगे।
तुम हमारी नहीं, अपनी फिक्र करो कि तुम में से कौन जिंदा बचेगा। जनरल डायर।
यस सर।
एयरपोर्ट चलने की तैयारी करो।
That's General Dyer.
साइमन।
Now this is Simon.
सबका नाम भी शहीदों में शामिल कर दो। ओके सर।
Okay, I think that's probably enough of Mard for the moment, but you get the general idea of the approach towards history or the view of other people that you can find there. And I mean, just to tell you roughly what happens, they actually managed to get all of the loot into a small aeroplane, but King Azad Singh is notified, and he comes on horseback, and he lassos the tail of the light aircraft, and he manages to drag it back, pull it, get all the loot out, and then you're only about 10 minutes in, and it's a 3-hour film. So that's the thing. But that's Bollywood for you. Although, in fact, you see now, if a Bollywood film was being made, with India kind of richer and more self-confident, you'd have a kind of more balanced view of that period of history. So a movie like The Rising, for example, has a much more accurate account of history. But what I'd like to leave you with, really, is three ways of looking at India, three ideas about India. Now, the first is obvious, and I won't talk about it for more than a moment, and that is the economic idea. The idea that if you have an 8 or 9% annual growth rate and you compound that over the course of 20 years, it puts India in a completely different relationship with a country like Britain to how it would have been, say, 10 or 20 years ago. And that process of transformation is something that is only likely to accelerate. It won't be consistent. There will still be huge numbers of very poor people in India, but there will also be the super rich, and there will be the dynamic middle class. But to go on to the next slide, there's also the idea of social transformation, which I think is often forgotten in India. So you can think of the idea of dynamic politicians and dynamic women politicians in India. So here you have Sonia Gandhi at her marriage to Rajiv Gandhi. She's Italian-born. She's marrying the son of the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, and you can see here she's at her Mehendi ceremony, having the henna put on her hands. But if you like, the kind of social revolution that happened in India happened about 80 years ago. So, for example, the debate over the veil, the debate over purdah, which goes on in Britain today, was a debate which took place in the 1930s and 40s in India, which meant that Hindu women, who make up about let's say about 500 million people in India. You've got to think of the huge numbers. It is very, very rare for a Hindu woman ever to be veiled, whereas it would have been a frequent, almost obligatory sight 100 years ago. So that process of social transformation has gone on for a long time. And if you go on to the next slide, you'll see again Sonia Gandhi. I just had to show you this because when I found this picture on the internet of Sonia Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi in Delhi, this is before he becomes Prime Minister, before he gets assassinated and she becomes the most powerful woman in India. And the caption said, "Ice cream vendor is Manmohan Singh." He's the Prime Minister, of course, but I don't think that's true. But anyway, to move on to the next image, the point I'm making really is that it's not only about people like Sonia Gandhi or these big-name figures. It's also like people such as Jayalalitha, the most powerful politician in Tamil Nadu in the south, or another woman politician, Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal, who after the assembly elections in a week's time is probably going to displace the communists from ruling West Bengal after 30 or 40 years. And then perhaps most well-known, at least in India, because she's such a kind of figure of love and hate, Mayawati, the chief minister of Uttar Pradesh, the largest state in India, about 130 million people living there. It's about the size of Brazil, and she is somebody who comes from a poor slum background, and yet she managed to end up as one of the most powerful politicians in the country and the chief minister of the largest state. And you can see her there being garlanded with, can you work out what she's being garlanded with? It's 1,000 rupee notes. And because she comes from a Dalit background, because she's made it from a community that would historically have been severely discriminated against, she is seen as a figure who, if you like, has won the right to be garlanded with banknotes. You see, Cash for Questions and the kind of scandal about MPs' expenses is nothing compared to what goes on in India. If you ever try to explain that kind of thing to an Indian journalist or an Indian politician, they scratch their head in bafflement. If you think the total amount taken by British MPs in dodgy expenses was about £1 million, so it's kind of chicken feed. But anyway, to go on to the final point that I wanted to make, in this slide you can see what to me is a typical image of India. It's 1966, and you've got the cone of a rocket being carried on a bicycle. And one of the remarkable things that the founding parents of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru most famously did, was that they set up many of the mechanisms which have enabled India to triumph in the last 10 or 15 years. For example, the Indian Institutes of Technology, which turn out incredibly highly qualified graduates who you can see taking jobs all around the world. Or something like the Indian space program, which may seem like an extravagance in a country where there are a lot of poor people, but also has a lot of technological benefits which you can see across Indian technology, across the Indian software industry, and across all sorts of different parts of how the economy is growing. And I think probably what that comes out of is in part Indian versatility. Now, if you go to the next slide, you'll see something that you could only see in India. This is a particularly Indian kind of idea. The idea that everything is open, everything is up for grabs, everything can be... The idea that everything can be contradicted. You can have 4 of the 8 richest people in the world coming from India at the same time as 300 million people live in extreme poverty. You can have a superb education system at the higher end, and yet at the same time the primary education system not having been developed. You can have the fact that in Hindu philosophy there is no contradiction between science and religion, and so that gives you images like the next one. Now, what you're seeing here is the head of the Indian Space Research Organization performing as a deity. And so, if you like, it's quite possible to hold contradictory ideas in your head at the same time if you are thinking within the framework of Hindu philosophy. There's nothing within your religion that's saying you can do this or you can't do this. I mean, it's very hard, in a Christian or post-Christian country, could you imagine Richard Dawkins doing this or doing the equivalent of this? You can't intellectually perceive it, and yet here it's quite a normal thing in its way to be doing. And so what that's really saying to you is that in India, for every 3 steps forward, there are probably going to be 2 steps backwards, and then 1 step sideways, and then another one forward. So the closing image I'd like to leave you with is Dr. K. Radhakrishnan, the head of the Indian Space Research Organization, performing as the deity Heinemann. Thank you very much.